Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into this health issue that's, well, surprisingly common, but it doesn't always get, the attention it deserves. We're talking about insulin resistance, and we're going to be drawing insights from Benjamin Bikman's book, Why We Get Sick. And trust me, it's just packed with really eye-opening information you won't want to miss.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It often flies under the radar, and it's kind of alarming when you consider just how many people it affects. Bikman estimates that up to half of U.S. adults might have insulin resistance.
Wow.
And some estimates even put that figure as high as a staggering 88%.
That's a huge portion of the population. Really makes you wonder how many people are walking around with this without even realizing it. So let's break it down. What exactly is happening in the body when we talk about insulin resistance?
So essentially, it disrupts your body's ability to regulate blood sugar. Normally, after you eat, your body releases insulin. Insulin's a hormone that acts like a key. It unlocks your cells to allow glucose to enter and provide energy.
So it's like a delivery system bringing fuel to the cells, right?
Precisely. But with insulin resistance, those cells, they become less responsive to insulin. The key doesn't work as effectively, and the glucose can't get in as easily. This leads to higher than normal levels of both glucose and insulin circulating in your blood.
And Bikman really stresses that it's the insulin, not just the glucose, that we need to pay attention to. He even makes the argument that, this whole focus on glucose and diabetes has been kind of a red herring, and that insulin is the real culprit behind a lot of health problems.
Yes, and this is a crucial point. You see, for a long time, the spotlight has been on glucose. But Bikman's work suggests that insulin plays a much bigger role than we initially thought.
So what kind of health problems are we talking about here? Bikman really goes into great detail about how insulin resistance can affect almost every system in the body, and it's pretty mind-blowing.
Oh, he covers a really wide range of conditions, everything from cardiovascular issues and neurological disorders to reproductive health challenges. He even talks about an increased risk of cancer.
Let's start with the heart. It's not just about carrying extra weight, putting strain on your heart. Bikman reveals how insulin can actually directly impact blood pressure.
Right. It seems that insulin can actually cause your body to retain more salt and water. This increases your blood volume, and as a result, it leads to elevated blood pressure. And it doesn't stop there. It also affects your blood vessel walls, making them thicker. You see, insulin normally promotes cell growth, which is, a healthy process. But with insulin resistance, those signals, they get amplified. This leads to a thickening of the inner lining of your blood vessels.
And that can contribute to, atherosclerosis, right? Those dangerous plaques that build up in our arteries and increase the risk of heart attacks and strokes.
Precisely. Now, let's talk about cholesterol. It's a topic that's often shrouded in misunderstanding. There's this common misconception that LDL cholesterol is inherently bad, but it's actually more nuanced than that. Bikman highlights the importance of considering LDL particle size and density.
So it's not just about the total LDL number that we see in a cholesterol test.
Exactly. Smaller, denser LDL particles, they're actually more likely to penetrate the walls of your blood vessels. And this can contribute to plaque formation compared to the larger, less dense particles.
So how can you determine which type of LDL you have?
Well, there's actually a really straightforward ratio you can calculate using your triglyceride and HDL cholesterol levels. So you would take your triglycerides and divide them by your HDL. If the result is less than 2, you probably have more of the larger, less harmful LDL. But if it's higher than 2, well, then you likely have more of the smaller, denser, and potentially more problematic type.
I see.
Bikman also talks about a heart condition called cardiomyopathy, where the heart muscle, it struggles to pump blood effectively. And he specifically draws a connection between insulin resistance and dilated cardiomyopathy. Now, dilated cardiomyopathy is a condition where the heart's chambers become enlarged and weakened. And the heart, it relies on glucose for fuel. But insulin resistance hinders its ability to use it. It's essentially depriving the heart of the energy it needs to function properly.
It's incredible how something like insulin resistance can directly impact the heart's ability to pump blood. Really highlights just how interconnected our bodily systems are and how a problem in one area can have these widespread repercussions.
Absolutely. And those repercussions, they extend to the brain as well. We used to think that the brain didn't respond to insulin at all, but we now know that's completely inaccurate.
So the brain actually has insulin receptors and needs insulin to function correctly.
Precisely. And when the brain becomes resistant to insulin, it can impair cognitive functions. potentially leading to memory issues, difficulties with learning, and even affecting our eating behaviors.
Bikman even suggests that for every decade of insulin resistance, the brain might appear 2 years older than that of an insulin-sensitive individual of the same age. It's almost as if insulin resistance is actually accelerating the aging process within the brain.
And the link to Alzheimer's disease is particularly interesting.
Yeah, right. Bikman actually refers to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes because insulin resistance seems to play such a significant role.
You know, it's fascinating because for years we sort of attributed the cognitive decline in Alzheimer's patients to a sedentary lifestyle. But now research is showing that even physically active individuals with Alzheimer's, well, they exhibit more insulin resistance than their healthy counterparts.
That's right. And this suggests that insulin resistance is not merely a consequence of inactivity, but might actually be a driving force behind the disease process itself.
Wow.
Bikman also links insulin resistance to vascular dementia, which is the second most prevalent type of dementia.
Vascular dementia results from reduced blood flow to the brain. And as we've discussed, insulin resistance can negatively impact the function of our blood vessels.
So it's kind of a double whammy for the brain.
Yeah.
You've got insulin resistance that can damage the blood vessels, leading to vascular dementia. And then you've got it directly hindering brain cell function, potentially contributing to Alzheimer's. It's a pretty sobering reminder of how addressing insulin resistance early on could be vital for safeguarding brain health in the long run.
Indeed, and its implications, they extend far beyond the brain and heart. You might be surprised to learn that insulin resistance can also significantly impact reproductive health, and it affects both men and women.
Yeah, that's a side of insulin resistance that many people just don't really consider. I was especially intrigued by Bikman's observation that pregnancy is actually a naturally insulin-resistant state, which, kind of seems counterintuitive at first glance.
It does, but there's a good reason for it. During pregnancy, the body actually becomes temporarily more resistant to insulin. And this is to ensure that there's sufficient energy available to support the developing baby and the growth of the placenta.
So in this case, insulin resistance actually serves a beneficial purpose.
Right, but when it's not related to pregnancy, well, then things can get a little more complicated. Bikman points out that insulin resistance is connected to gestational diabetes. This is a type of diabetes that occurs during pregnancy.
Right.
Now, gestational diabetes, it poses risks for both the mother and the baby during the pregnancy. And it also significantly increases the mother's chances of developing type 2 diabetes later on.
Bikman even states that her risk of developing type 2 diabetes is actually 7 times greater than a woman who didn't have gestational diabetes during pregnancy.
That's right. And then there's also the risk of preeclampsia. This is a very serious condition that affects kidney function and can be quite dangerous during pregnancy. Research suggests that women who develop more pronounced insulin resistance in early pregnancy, well, they have a higher risk of developing preeclampsia later on.
It's amazing how all of these things are so interconnected. How insulin resistance can trigger these cascading effects on different systems within the body. And the effects, they're not even limited to what's happening during the pregnancy, right? I mean, a mother's insulin levels can impact a child's health even before they're born.
That's absolutely true. The mother's metabolic health during pregnancy can have a huge impact on the baby's development. Elevated insulin levels and insulin resistance in the mother can lead to a larger than average baby. This can increase the risk of complications during delivery, and it can even influence the child's long-term metabolic health.
Bikman even mentions that babies born to mothers with higher insulin levels have a greater chance of developing insulin resistance themselves, even if they appear healthy at birth. It's almost as if the stage for future health problems is being set during those critical prenatal months.
It highlights the really far-reaching consequences of insulin resistance and really underscores the importance of managing it, not only for individual health, but also for the well-being of future generations.
Now let's focus specifically on how insulin resistance impacts fertility in women. Bikman goes into some detail about polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. This is a hormonal disorder that's surprisingly common and is often associated with insulin resistance.
Yeah. PCOS affects a large number of women, and it can really disrupt the delicate hormonal balance that's involved in ovulation. This can make conception quite difficult.
Bikman explains that in women with PCOS, elevated insulin levels can interfere with the ovary's normal function, leading to irregular periods, the development of cysts on the ovaries, and even fertility challenges.
And it's not just limited to the ovaries themselves. Insulin resistance can also affect the brain's signaling of reproductive hormones, further complicating the situation.
So it sounds like PCOS is a complex interplay of factors, but insulin resistance definitely plays a key role in many cases.
Addressing insulin resistance is often a crucial step for effectively managing PCOS and improving fertility outcomes.
And it's not just women who are affected by this. Insulin resistance can impact fertility in men as well. Bikman points out that men with insulin resistance face an increased risk of erectile dysfunction.
This might seem a little unexpected at first, but when you consider how insulin can affect blood vessel function, it starts to make sense.
Right, because erections depend on healthy blood flow. So if your blood vessels aren't functioning optimally because of insulin resistance, well, that can definitely lead to problems.
It's like a domino effect,
Yeah.
Insulin resistance sets off this chain of events that ultimately impact erectile function.
And it goes beyond just the physical factors. Insulin resistance can also disrupt sperm production by affecting the balance of hormones, like testosterone.
It's a reminder that hormonal health is really closely intertwined with metabolic health, and insulin plays a central role in that connection.
Bikman brings up another interesting point that might surprise some listeners. He talks about the link between insulin resistance and early puberty in children.
This really illustrates how insulin's influence extends far beyond just regulating blood sugar.
Bikman explains that high insulin levels can increase the production of leptin. Now, leptin is a hormone that's produced by fat cells, and it helps regulate appetite and metabolism, but it also influences the onset of puberty.
That's right. And because insulin levels are often higher in individuals who are overweight or obese, this can essentially create a hormonal environment that triggers puberty to start earlier than it normally would.
Bikman even quantifies it, stating that for each unit increase in body mass index, which is a rough indicator of body fat, between the ages of 2 and 8, puberty is likely to commence about a month earlier.
It really underscores how lifestyle factors, especially diet and weight, can have a profound impact on hormonal development in children.
And it's not just about kids who are overweight, right? I mean, children who are born underweight can also experience early puberty.
That's right. Bikman explains that being born underweight can increase the risk of developing insulin resistance later in life, potentially triggering early puberty. It's like this really complex web of factors that can set a child on this path toward early hormonal changes.
It's a fascinating area of research. It's shedding light on how these early life experiences can actually shape our long-term health outcomes. It emphasizes the importance of a healthy start in life and how those early years can really have these lasting consequences. Now let's shift our attention to the connection between insulin resistance and cancer. This link is actually gaining more and more recognition in the medical community.
It is, and cancer is a complex disease with many contributing factors. But insulin resistance is increasingly emerging as a significant player.
Bikman highlights how cancer cells often have a greater number of insulin receptors, making them more sensitive to insulin's growth-promoting signals.
It's almost as if cancer cells hijack insulin's growth-promoting abilities to fuel their uncontrolled proliferation.
And to compound the issue, you have these high insulin levels in the blood, which is a hallmark of insulin resistance. And that can actually further stimulate cancer cell growth.
It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. It creates a perfect storm for cancer development.
Bikman specifically mentions breast, prostate, and colorectal cancers as having these really strong links to insulin resistance.
And these are, some of the most common and often deadliest cancers. And the fact that insulin resistance plays a role, well, it's a wake-up call to take this metabolic condition very seriously.
Starting with breast cancer, which is the most common cancer among women in the U.S., Bikman states that women with the highest fasting insulin levels, which is a sign of insulin resistance, they tend to have the worst breast cancer outcomes. He even points out a startling statistic. He says the average breast cancer tumor actually has over 6 times more insulin receptors than normal breast tissue.
That's a huge difference. And it means that those cancer cells are essentially primed to respond to insulin's growth signals, which can potentially drive tumor growth and increase the cancer's aggressiveness.
It's as if those cancer cells are addicted to insulin, constantly craving more to fuel their growth.
It's a really powerful image that highlights the dangers of uncontrolled insulin signaling.
Moving on to prostate cancer, Bikman explains that men with insulin resistance are at a greater risk of developing this type of cancer, and it can also make existing prostate cancer more aggressive.
Like breast cancer, prostate cancer often displays an increased number of insulin receptors, and this makes it particularly vulnerable to insulin's growth-promoting effects.
It's as if these cancer cells have this heightened ability to exploit insulin for their own harmful purposes.
It serves as a stark reminder that men, too, need to be aware of insulin resistance and its potential impact on their health.
Finally, let's talk about colorectal cancer, which affects the colon and rectum. Bikman explains that insulin resistance is associated with an increased risk of developing this type of cancer and can also make it more deadly.
Studies have shown that colorectal cancer patients with insulin resistance are about 3 times more likely to die from the disease compared to those without insulin resistance.
That's a really substantial difference. It highlights the importance of considering insulin resistance as a key factor in cancer prognosis.
It's yet another piece of the puzzle that's helping us unravel the complex relationship between our metabolism and cancer.
You know, this next topic might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think about insulin resistance, but it turns out that insulin can actually influence the health of our skin, muscles, bones, and joints. It's really remarkable just how far-reaching its impact truly is. Let's start with skin health.
Right. The skin is our largest organ, and it's definitely not immune to the effects of insulin resistance.
Bikman talks about a skin condition called acanthosis nigricans, and this can actually be an early indicator of insulin resistance.
Right. Acanthosis nigricans causes these dark velvety patches to develop on the skin, typically in areas like the neck, armpits, and groin. It's thought to be caused by high insulin levels stimulating an excessive production of melanin. Melanin is the pigment that's responsible for our skin's color.
So it's like a prime example of how a metabolic imbalance can actually manifest in these visible ways on our skin.
Exactly. Bikman also mentions skin tags, which are those small, fleshy growths that can appear on the skin.
Right.
While they're often harmless, skin tags are also associated with insulin resistance.
It's like another clue that something might be amiss with our metabolic health.
It's definitely worth paying attention to these kind of subtle signs, as they could be these early warnings of underlying insulin resistance.
Now let's talk about psoriasis. Psoriasis is a chronic skin condition that's characterized by these red, itchy, scaly patches. And Bikman points out that individuals with psoriasis are actually significantly more likely to have metabolic complications like insulin resistance.
That's right. In fact, they're almost 3 times more likely to be insulin resistant than those without psoriasis.
It seems like there's a connection between the inflammation that's associated with psoriasis and the development of insulin resistance.
It's an area of ongoing research, but it certainly suggests that managing insulin resistance could actually benefit individuals with psoriasis.
And it's not just chronic skin conditions like psoriasis that are affected. Bikman even brings up acne, which is something that many people experience, particularly during adolescence, but it can persist into adulthood as well.
Right. Acne is an inflammatory skin condition that's, characterized by pimples, blackheads, and whiteheads.
And Bikman notes that studies have actually shown that people with acne, regardless of whether they're lean or overweight, well, they tend to have higher fasting insulin levels than those without acne.
It suggests that insulin itself might be involved in acne development, potentially by influencing the production of sebum, which is the oily substance that can clog pores and contribute to those breakouts.
So it's another example of how seemingly unrelated health issues might actually share this common underlying thread, insulin resistance.
It reminds us that examining health from a holistic perspective can sometimes reveal surprising connections.
Now, let's focus on muscles. It's not surprising that insulin plays a role in muscle function because muscles are these major consumers of glucose. But insulin resistance can actually disrupt this process.
Right. Muscles depend on insulin to take up glucose from the bloodstream for energy. And when they become insulin resistant, well, this process is hindered.
And Bikman explains that this can result in muscle weakness and fatigue because the muscles are basically being deprived of the fuel they need to function properly.
Yeah, it's like trying to run a car on an empty tank. The muscles simply can't perform at their best without that adequate supply of glucose.
And it's not just about energy levels either, right? Insulin resistance can also interfere with muscle growth and repair.
That's true. You see, insulin typically promotes protein synthesis, which is essential for building and repairing muscle tissue. But when insulin signaling is disrupted, muscle growth and repair can be compromised. And this can lead to muscle loss and weakness over time.
So it's like this vicious cycle where insulin resistance can lead to muscle decline, and then that muscle loss can actually further exacerbate insulin resistance. It's like a downward spiral that can be really tough to escape.
It really highlights the importance of not only maintaining muscle mass for strength and mobility, but also for metabolic health.
It seems like insulin's reach extends beyond muscles to our bones and joints as well. It's not something we typically associate with insulin, but it's a vital connection to understand.
It is. Our bones are constantly undergoing this process of renewal, where old bone is being broken down and new bone is being formed.
Yeah.
And insulin actually plays a role in this process, helping to regulate the balance between bone formation and breakdown.
I see.
However, when insulin resistance sets in, it can disrupt this delicate balance, essentially tipping the scales toward increased bone breakdown. And this can raise the risk of conditions like osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is characterized by weak and brittle bones.
So it's almost as if insulin resistance is silently undermining the integrity of our skeletal system.
It reminds us that bone health isn't just about calcium and vitamin D, it's also about managing metabolic health.
And it's not just bone density that's affected either. Insulin resistance can also impact the health of our joints.
Our joints are complex structures that allow our bones to move smoothly, and their health really relies on this delicate balance of cartilage, synovial fluid, and other components.
And Bikman explains that insulin resistance can actually contribute to the development of osteoarthritis. This is a degenerative joint disease that causes pain, stiffness, and limited mobility.
That's right. You see, high insulin levels, they can promote inflammation inside the joints. And this can lead to cartilage breakdown and damage to the surrounding tissues, which, as you can imagine, contributes to osteoarthritis development.
So it's almost as if insulin resistance is adding fuel to the fire of joint inflammation, accelerating the wear and tear on our joints.
It's another great example of how a metabolic imbalance can have far-reaching consequences for our musculoskeletal health.
And it's not only osteoarthritis that's linked to insulin resistance, is it? Bikman also discusses gout, which is a painful inflammatory condition that affects the joints.
That's right. Gout is caused by a buildup of uric acid crystals in the joints. And this leads to intense pain and inflammation.
Right.
And it turns out that insulin resistance can actually interfere with the body's ability to properly excrete uric acid. This can contribute to its accumulation in the joints, which of course increases the risk of those painful gout attacks.
So it's almost like insulin resistance is disrupting the body's waste disposal system, leading to this buildup of harmful substances that then trigger these painful flare-ups.
It's a really interesting connection, and it's yet another example of how seemingly unconnected health issues can be linked back to insulin resistance.
Now, let's shift our attention to the digestive system, where insulin resistance can actually cause a whole host of problems, from heartburn and fatty liver disease to even issues with our gallbladder. It's really quite remarkable.
The digestive system, its main job is to break down food and absorb nutrients. But insulin resistance can really disrupt its normal functioning.
Let's start with gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. It's a condition that causes heartburn and acid reflux.
GERD occurs when stomach acid flows back up into the esophagus, causing a burning sensation in the chest.
Right.
And Bikman explains that insulin resistance can contribute to GERD by impairing the function of the lower esophageal sphincter. Now, the lower esophageal sphincter is that muscle that normally prevents stomach acid from refluxing back into the esophagus.
Okay.
When this muscle weakens, stomach acid can more easily escape back up, which can lead to those GERD symptoms.
So it's almost like insulin resistance is loosening the valve that's supposed to keep that stomach acid in its proper place.
That's a great analogy. It's a good reminder that even these seemingly minor digestive issues, they can be connected to metabolic health.
Now, let's discuss fatty liver disease, or NAFLD. It's a condition where fat accumulates in the liver.
Right. NAFLD is actually becoming increasingly prevalent, and it's very closely tied to insulin resistance.
And Bikman explains that high insulin levels can actually encourage the storage of fat in the liver, contributing to the development of NAFLD.
It's almost as if insulin is directing that excess fat to be deposited in the liver, and this can overload this vital organ and interfere with its normal function.
And what's particularly concerning is that NAFLD can progress to more serious liver diseases, like cirrhosis and even liver cancer.
It's a silent epidemic that's often undiagnosed until it reaches a really advanced stage.
That's a sobering thought. It really emphasizes how taking care of our metabolic health is crucial for protecting our liver. And this might seem like an unusual connection, but it turns out that insulin resistance can also impact our gallbladder.
The gallbladder is a small organ that stores bile, which is a fluid that aids in fat digestion.
Okay.
And Bikman explains that insulin can actually slow down gallbladder motility. Motility refers to how often the gallbladder contracts to release bile.
I see.
And when this slows down, the bile can become thick and sluggish, and this increases the risk of gallstones, those hard deposits that can form in the gallbladder and cause pain and inflammation.
It's like insulin resistance is making the gallbladder lazy, hindering its ability to empty efficiently and creating this favorable environment for gallstones to form.
That's a really great way to put it. It's yet another example of how seemingly unconnected health issues can actually be traced back to insulin resistance.
Now let's turn our attention to the kidneys. They're essential for filtering those waste products from the blood and maintaining fluid balance in the body.
The kidneys are incredibly hardworking organs, and they're unfortunately quite susceptible to the effects of insulin resistance. Bikman explains that those high insulin levels can damage the delicate filtering units in the kidneys. They're called nephrons, and this can impair their ability to function properly.
So it's like insulin resistance is slowly clogging the kidney's filtration system, putting a strain on these vital organs.
And this can lead to a buildup of waste products in the blood and even contribute to the development of chronic kidney disease.
What's especially concerning is that kidney disease often doesn't exhibit any symptoms in its early stages, so people might not even realize they have a problem until it's quite advanced.
Right, which emphasizes the importance of regular checkups and monitoring your kidney function, especially if you have risk factors like insulin resistance.
Okay, now let's move on to two interconnected conditions that are often at the forefront of discussions about insulin resistance.
Yeah.
Metabolic syndrome and obesity.
Right. So metabolic syndrome is basically a cluster of conditions that increase your risk of developing serious health problems like heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes.
Right.
And insulin resistance is a central component of metabolic syndrome. It's often considered the underlying driver of this really dangerous combination of conditions. The other components of metabolic syndrome include high blood pressure, high blood sugar, abnormal cholesterol levels, and of course, excess abdominal fat. And these conditions often occur together, which can create this perfect storm for health issues.
It's almost as if insulin resistance is the ringleader, orchestrating this whole ensemble of metabolic disturbances.
And then you have obesity, which is defined as having an excessive amount of body fat. And obesity is closely intertwined with both insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome.
It's a complex relationship.
It is. But Bikman explains that insulin actually plays a really key role in regulating fat storage in the body. And when insulin signaling goes awry, it can lead to increased fat accumulation.
So insulin normally signals the body to store excess energy as fat.
Right.
But in the context of insulin resistance, this process gets dysregulated, leading to excessive fat storage, particularly in the abdominal area.
That's exactly right. And abdominal fat, also known as visceral fat, is particularly harmful because it surrounds vital organs and releases inflammatory substances that can actually worsen insulin resistance and contribute to metabolic syndrome.
So it's like a vicious cycle where insulin resistance promotes fat storage, and then that excess fat further exacerbates the insulin resistance, creating this cascade of negative consequences.
It's like a metabolic tug of war, with insulin resistance constantly pulling the body toward fat storage and a whole host of health problems.
It's a reminder that managing insulin resistance is not just about weight loss. It's really about restoring metabolic balance and optimizing how your body utilizes energy.
Exactly. It's about getting to the root of the problem and addressing those underlying metabolic imbalances. Bikman actually uses a really compelling example to illustrate how insulin can actually override this whole idea of just straightforward calorie counting when it comes to fat storage. He looks at the two primary types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2.
Okay, so type 1 diabetes is the one that's often diagnosed in childhood, right? It's an autoimmune condition where the body actually attacks those cells that produce insulin.
Exactly. And this results in an insulin deficiency. So without insulin, the body struggles to actually store fat effectively no matter how many calories a person eats. Individuals with type 1 diabetes who don't receive insulin injections, well, they can experience significant weight loss and actually become dangerously thin.
Which is in, stark contrast to type 2 diabetes, where insulin resistance leads to those high insulin levels in the blood, which promotes fat storage and often leads to obesity.
Yeah.
It's really a powerful illustration of how insulin's effect on fat storage goes beyond simple calorie intake and expenditure.
Absolutely. It really underscores the need to understand the hormonal underpinnings of weight gain instead of simply focusing on calorie numbers. Now, let's delve into the fascinating world of fat cells. Not all fat is created equal, and understanding the differences is key to really grasping how insulin resistance contributes to obesity and metabolic dysfunction.
Right, right. Fat cells, or adipocytes, they aren't just these passive containers for excess calories, are they?
No, they're not. They're actually active endocrine organs that produce hormones.
Yeah.
And they have a really crucial role in regulating our metabolism. Bikman explains that there are two main types of fat cells, subcutaneous fat and visceral fat. Subcutaneous fat is the fat that lies just beneath the skin, while visceral fat is stored deeper within the abdominal cavity surrounding our vital organs.
So visceral fat is the type that we should be more concerned about.
Yes, definitely. Visceral fat is far more problematic when it comes to insulin resistance and metabolic health. You see, it's more metabolically active than subcutaneous fat, and it releases more inflammatory substances and hormones that contribute to insulin resistance and other health issues.
So it's like having this hidden fire burning deep inside, constantly fueling inflammation and disrupting metabolic balance.
That's a great analogy. And the distribution of fat in the body can also influence the risk of developing insulin resistance and other health problems. Bikman talks about, the apple shape versus the pear shape.
Right, right. Those terms refer to body shapes, right? The apple shape describes more fat being stored around the abdomen, while the pear shape describes more fat around the hips and thighs.
Exactly. And it's the apple shape, with its higher proportion of visceral fat, that's associated with a greater risk of insulin resistance and metabolic disease.
I see.
Bikman actually mentions a really simple test you can do to determine which fat pattern you might have. He says if you can grab a handful of fat and it kind of jiggles, well, that's likely subcutaneous fat, the less harmful kind. But if your belly feels really hard and firm, that indicates a higher proportion of visceral fat, which is the more dangerous type.
It's kind of a basic but effective way to assess your fat distribution and potential health risks.
It is. Now let's talk about how fat cells themselves can actually become insulin resistant. This creates a vicious cycle that promotes further fat storage and metabolic dysfunction. Like other cells in the body, fat cells rely on insulin to take up glucose for energy and to store fat.
But when insulin resistance develops, they become less responsive to insulin signals, right?
Right, and that interferes with their ability to function properly. Normally, insulin stimulates fat cells to store fat and suppress the release of stored fat into the bloodstream. But when insulin resistance occurs, well, fat cells become less efficient at storing fat, and they actually start releasing more stored fat into circulation.
So it's almost like those fat cells become leaky, constantly dripping fat into the bloodstream.
I like that analogy, yeah. And this excess fat, it contributes to those elevated triglyceride levels, which are a risk factor for heart disease. And it can worsen insulin resistance in other tissues, like muscles and the liver. It's a cascade of negative effects that really emphasizes the importance of addressing insulin resistance at its source.
So restoring that insulin sensitivity is key to escaping this metabolic trap. But what causes those fat cells to become insulin resistant in the first place?
Well, Bikman, he delves into a few different factors, and he highlights this one particularly harmful fat molecule called 4-hydroxynonol, or 4-HNE for short. It's actually a toxic byproduct of fat oxidation, a process that occurs when fats are exposed to these damaging free radicals.
Right, free radicals, those are those unstable molecules that can damage cells.
Exactly. And 4-HNE can actually directly damage fat cells, making them less responsive to insulin and contributing to the development of insulin resistance.
It's like 4-HNE is this saboteur wreaking havoc on our fat cells and disrupting their normal functioning.
It's a great description. And what's concerning is that 4-HNE is actually abundant in the modern Western diet, which is typically high in processed foods and unhealthy fats. And this really highlights how the food we eat can directly impact our metabolic health, even down to the cellular level.
It's a powerful reminder that we really need to be mindful of the foods we choose. So beyond diet, what other factors contribute to insulin resistance?
Insulin resistance, it's complex. There are multiple contributing factors, and understanding these factors is crucial for developing effective prevention and treatment strategies.
So let's start with genetics. Do our genes determine whether or not we're going to develop insulin resistance?
While our genes do influence our predisposition to insulin resistance, they don't tell the whole story. We inherit a set of genes from our parents, and some genes can affect how sensitive our bodies are to insulin.
But even with a genetic predisposition, we're not necessarily destined to develop insulin resistance, right?
That's right. Lifestyle factors like our diet, how much we exercise, how we manage stress can really significantly influence whether those genetic predispositions actually translate into insulin resistance. It's kind of like having a loaded gun. Genetics might provide the gun, but our lifestyle choices are what pull the trigger.
That's a powerful analogy. Now, what about aging? Does our age affect our insulin sensitivity?
Unfortunately, yeah. Aging is another factor that can contribute to insulin resistance. As we get older, our bodies naturally become less sensitive to insulin. And this is, partly due to age-related changes in our body composition, our hormone levels, and even how our cells function.
So as we age, we tend to lose muscle mass, gain fat, and that can contribute to insulin resistance.
Exactly. And hormonal changes, particularly in women during menopause and in men as testosterone levels decline, can also play a role.
So it's like our bodies gradually lose their metabolic edge as we age.
It is a natural process, but, we can take steps to kind of mitigate those age-related changes by maintaining a healthy lifestyle and managing other risk factors. Speaking of factors, here's one that might surprise you. Too much insulin itself can actually contribute to insulin resistance.
Wait, so having high insulin levels can make the insulin resistance worse?
It might seem counterintuitive, but it's a classic example of the body trying to protect itself from excess. When insulin levels are chronically elevated, as they are in insulin resistance, the body's cells can actually become desensitized to insulin's signals. They essentially downregulate their insulin receptors to reduce their exposure to this constant hormonal overload.
So it's like the cells are building a wall to protect themselves from the constant bombardment of insulin.
And this protective mechanism, while, well-intended, it can actually worsen the insulin resistance, creating this vicious cycle where high insulin levels lead to even further insulin resistance.
It's kind of a metabolic catch-22. Okay, what about stress? I mean, we all experience stress to some degree, but can it affect insulin resistance?
Oh, absolutely. Stress triggers the release of hormones like cortisol, which is often referred to as the stress hormone. And while cortisol is beneficial in these sort of short bursts, when it's chronically elevated, it can have some detrimental metabolic effects.
So how does cortisol actually affect insulin resistance?
Well, cortisol promotes the breakdown of muscle tissue for energy, and it also increases glucose production in the liver. And both of those things can contribute to insulin resistance. It's almost as if stress hijacks our metabolism, pushing our bodies toward insulin resistance and fat storage.
It's a good reminder that managing stress isn't just important for our mental health, but it's also crucial for our metabolic health as well. Are there any other hormonal influences on insulin sensitivity?
Yeah, actually, thyroid disorders can also have an impact on insulin sensitivity. You see, the thyroid gland produces hormones that regulate our metabolism. And if there are any imbalances in these hormones, they can affect how our bodies respond to insulin.
So both an overactive thyroid, which is known as hyperthyroidism, and an underactive thyroid, known as hypothyroidism, can contribute to insulin resistance.
That's right. Hyperthyroidism, it can actually accelerate metabolism, which can lead to this increased demand for insulin. And that can potentially overwhelm the pancreas's ability to produce enough insulin. And then hypothyroidism, on the other hand, can slow down metabolism, reducing the body's need for insulin and potentially causing insulin resistance to develop.
So it's a reminder that hormonal imbalances can really have these wide-ranging effects on metabolic health. Now, I've also heard about something called thyroid resistance. What exactly is that?
Thyroid resistance is a condition where the body basically becomes less responsive to thyroid hormones. Even if the thyroid gland itself is producing normal amounts, it's often linked to obesity, and it can definitely contribute to insulin resistance.
So as body fat increases, the body's tissues actually become less sensitive to those thyroid hormones.
Yeah, and this essentially means that you need higher levels of those hormones to achieve their metabolic effects. And this can lead to a cascade of metabolic disturbances, including insulin resistance. It's as if obesity is creating this hormonal roadblock, hindering the thyroid's ability to effectively regulate metabolism.
It really underscores that obesity isn't just a cosmetic concern. It's a complex metabolic disorder with far-reaching consequences.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about these internal factors that contribute to insulin resistance. But can external factors, like our environment, also play a role?
Oh, absolutely. Our environment has a significant impact on our overall health. and exposure to certain environmental pollutants can actually contribute to insulin resistance.
Can you give some examples of these pollutants?
One major concern is air pollution. It's a growing problem in many parts of the world. Air pollution is made up of, this mixture of harmful substances, including particulate matter, ozone, and other pollutants. And these can trigger inflammation and something called oxidative stress in the body. And those inflammatory processes can directly damage cells and interfere with insulin signaling.
Precisely. It's as though air pollution is silently sabotaging our metabolic health, adding yet another layer of complexity to the insulin resistance puzzle.
It's a sobering reminder that protecting our environment is not just about preserving the planet, it's also about safeguarding our own health. What about chemicals that are found in, everyday products? Can those affect insulin resistance as well?
Yes, there's growing concern about certain chemicals in our environment that are known as endocrine disruptors. These chemicals can interfere with hormonal balance, and they can contribute to insulin resistance.
Right, because endocrine disruptors, they mimic or block the action of hormones in our bodies, disrupting that delicate balance of our endocrine system.
And some endocrine disruptors have actually been directly linked to insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. One example is bisphenol A, or BPA. It's a chemical that's found in many plastics and food packaging materials.
And BPA has been shown to interfere with insulin signaling and potentially increase the risk of insulin resistance and other metabolic problems.
It's a good reminder to be mindful of the products we use and the chemicals we're exposed to on a daily basis. Even seemingly harmless, everyday items can contain these hidden dangers to our health.
It's important to be aware of these hidden dangers and to make informed choices about the products we use in our daily lives. Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about a lifestyle factor that many people struggle with: sleep. In today's busy world, getting enough sleep often takes a backseat to other priorities. But can lack of sleep actually affect our insulin sensitivity?
It can, definitely. Sleep is crucial for restoring and repairing our bodies. And when we don't get enough sleep, it can disrupt that hormonal balance and contribute to insulin resistance.
So how does sleep deprivation actually impact insulin sensitivity?
Well, even just a few nights of inadequate sleep can actually reduce your insulin sensitivity, making it harder for your body to regulate blood sugar properly. You see, sleep deprivation disrupts the normal production of hormones like cortisol and growth hormone, both of which can influence how sensitive our bodies are to insulin. It's like throwing a wrench in our body's hormonal clock, disrupting that delicate balance that keeps our metabolism running smoothly.
So prioritizing sleep isn't just about feeling well rested, it's also about protecting our metabolic health. With all of these factors contributing to insulin resistance, it might seem kind of overwhelming to address. But what can we do to combat it and improve our metabolic health?
Well, the good news is that there are actually some very effective ways to prevent and even reverse insulin resistance. Lifestyle modifications, particularly diet and exercise, are the cornerstones of managing this condition.
So let's start with exercise. How does exercise actually help with insulin resistance?
Exercise is a powerful tool for improving insulin sensitivity and boosting overall health. It helps muscles use glucose for energy without relying on insulin, essentially providing an alternative pathway for glucose disposal.
It's almost as if exercise creates this detour for glucose, bypassing those insulin-resistant cells and allowing the muscles to directly absorb it.
I like that analogy. And this glucose clearing effect of exercise, it can last for hours, improving insulin sensitivity even after your workout is finished. It's like this metabolic afterglow that keeps our cells functioning more efficiently.
That's interesting. So what types of exercise are most beneficial for improving insulin sensitivity?
Well, there are two main types: aerobic exercise and resistance training. Aerobic exercise like running, swimming, or brisk walking, it elevates our heart rate, strengthens our lungs, improves our cardiovascular fitness, and it burns calories.
And resistance training, that involves lifting weights or using body weight exercises to build and maintain muscle mass, which is, as we've discussed, really crucial for insulin sensitivity.
Exactly. And Bikman, he emphasizes that both types of exercise are beneficial for improving insulin sensitivity. Ideally, we should aim to incorporate both into our routines. It's kind of like having a diversified portfolio for your metabolic health, using a variety of exercise strategies for optimal results.
Now, this one might sound a little surprising, but Bikman also suggests that cold exposure could actually be a beneficial strategy for improving insulin sensitivity.
I know it might seem counterintuitive, but research is actually showing that exposure to cold temperatures can activate something called brown fat, which is different from the white fat that we typically associate with, body fat.
Oh, right. I've heard about brown fat. It's beneficial for metabolic health because it burns calories to generate heat.
Yes, it acts like this metabolic furnace within the body. And studies have shown that activating brown fat through things like cold exposure can improve insulin sensitivity and glucose metabolism.
So cold exposure kind of gives our metabolism this jolt, firing up those brown fat cells and boosting our ability to regulate blood sugar effectively.
That's a great way to put it. You know, it's an exciting area of research that suggests that sometimes stepping outside of our comfort zones can actually have these unexpected health benefits.
I like that. Okay, so now let's dive into the dietary changes that can make a real difference when it comes to managing insulin resistance, because it seems like diet plays a huge role in all of this.
It does. Diet is a crucial piece of the puzzle, and adopting what's called an insulin sensitizing dietary approach is essential for restoring metabolic balance.
So what are the key principles of an insulin sensitizing diet?
Well, Bikman really emphasizes the importance of controlling carbohydrate intake, particularly those refined carbohydrates and sugars, because these cause those really rapid spikes in blood sugar and insulin levels.
Right. Refined carbohydrates like white bread, pasta, sugary drinks, those are all quickly digested and absorbed, sending blood sugar soaring and triggering a surge in insulin production.
It's like flooding the body with glucose, overwhelming the system, and contributing to insulin resistance over time.
Whereas those complex carbohydrates, like the ones found in whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, they're digested more slowly, resulting in more gradual increases in blood sugar and insulin levels.
Exactly. It's about providing a steady stream of energy rather than this sudden surge, which allows the body to, manage those glucose levels much more effectively.
I see.
And fiber, which is a type of carbohydrate that our bodies can't digest, is particularly beneficial because it slows down that sugar absorption and minimizes those insulin spikes.
So it's almost like adding a speed bump to the glucose highway, preventing those sudden surges that can contribute to insulin resistance.
I like that. Now, protein is another important macronutrient that plays a key role in managing insulin levels. Protein doesn't cause those big blood sugar spikes, and it can actually help to improve insulin sensitivity. It also promotes satiety, making us feel fuller for longer, and reducing the urge to overeat.
So protein is kind of like a metabolic ally, helping us regulate blood sugar and control our appetite. Now, dietary fat has often been portrayed as the enemy when it comes to, health and weight management. But where does fat actually fit into an insulin sensitizing diet?
Bikman actually argues that healthy fats are a vital part of an insulin sensitizing diet. Healthy fats, like the ones found in things like avocados, nuts, seeds, olive oil, fatty fish, and coconut oil, they don't cause those spikes in blood sugar or insulin levels. In fact, they can actually improve insulin sensitivity.
So fat is digested and absorbed more slowly, providing that sustained energy and helping us feel satisfied without messing with our blood sugar balance.
Exactly. And certain types of fat, like omega-3 fatty acids, have these anti-inflammatory properties that can be really beneficial for reducing insulin resistance and improving overall health. It's a good reminder that not all fats are created equal, and incorporating healthy fats into our diet is essential for metabolic well-being.
So it's not just about what we eat, but also about when we eat, right?
You're right. The timing of our meals can also play a role in managing those insulin levels. Bikman explains that intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding can be a really effective strategy for improving insulin sensitivity.
Okay, so intermittent fasting involves alternating periods of eating and fasting, which gives the body those regular breaks from digestion and insulin production.
Exactly. And this allows insulin levels to drop, giving the body a chance to kind of reset its insulin sensitivity and burn stored fat for energy. It's like giving our metabolism a vacation, allowing it to recharge and function more efficiently.
So are there different approaches to intermittent fasting?
Oh, there are definitely a variety of approaches. One popular method involves restricting eating to, an 8-hour window each day, essentially skipping breakfast or dinner. The key is to find an approach that fits your lifestyle and preferences and to pay attention to your body's signals.
So beyond diet and exercise, are there any other strategies that can help manage insulin resistance?
There are a few. Certain supplements and medications might be helpful, but it's important to emphasize that these strategies should always be discussed with your healthcare professional. They're not appropriate for everyone, and they could potentially interact with other medications or, pre-existing health conditions.
So can you tell us a little bit more about some of these supplements?
Sure. Bikman talks about, a variety of supplements that have shown some promise in improving insulin sensitivity, including magnesium, chromium, and berberine. Magnesium is a mineral that's involved in numerous bodily processes, including insulin signaling. And research suggests that magnesium supplementation might actually be able to improve insulin sensitivity.
Okay. What about chromium?
Chromium is a trace mineral that enhances insulin action, and some research suggests that chromium supplementation could be beneficial for those with insulin resistance.
And what is berberine?
Berberine is a compound that's derived from certain plants that has actually been used traditionally in Chinese medicine. And studies have shown that it can improve insulin sensitivity and also reduce blood sugar levels. It's important to note that, more research is definitely needed to fully understand the efficacy and safety of these supplements, but they do offer some potential avenues for supporting metabolic health.
So while these supplements seem promising, it's definitely best to discuss them with your healthcare provider before adding them into your routine.
Absolutely. Now, in situations where those lifestyle modifications alone aren't sufficient to manage insulin resistance, certain medications might be prescribed.
Can you give some examples of these medications?
One commonly prescribed medication for type 2 diabetes is metformin. And metformin helps to improve insulin sensitivity and reduce those blood sugar levels.
Are there other medications that work a little bit differently?
Yes, there are. Thiazolidinediones, or TZDs, are another class of medications that improve insulin sensitivity. They primarily work in fat cells. And then there are sulfonylureas and meglitinides, which work by stimulating the pancreas to produce more insulin.
So there are a few different medications available that can target insulin resistance through different mechanisms.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that medication should always be used under the guidance of a healthcare professional and as part of a comprehensive approach that includes those lifestyle changes.
Right. Now, for individuals with severe obesity who haven't found success with other weight loss methods, bariatric surgery might be an option to consider.
Yeah, bariatric surgery involves procedures that actually modify the digestive system to decrease food intake and promote weight loss.
So while bariatric surgery can be effective for weight loss and improving insulin sensitivity, it is a major procedure and it does come with, inherent risks.
That's correct. It should only be considered after a really careful evaluation and discussion with your healthcare provider. And it's essential to weigh the potential benefits against the risks. And also understand that bariatric surgery isn't a quick fix. It requires some pretty significant lifestyle adjustments and ongoing medical follow-up.
So it's not a decision to be made lightly. Okay, so now that we've really explored the science behind insulin resistance and the strategies for managing it, let's kind of put this knowledge into action with a practical plan for, actually assessing and addressing this condition. How can we determine if we actually have insulin resistance?
Well, the first step is to actually determine if you have insulin resistance, and this can be done through some blood tests that measure your fasting insulin levels.
And can you walk us through, how to interpret those results?
Certainly. Bikman provides some guidance on interpreting these results. He explains that fasting insulin levels below 6 URML generally suggest that you have good insulin sensitivity. Levels between 7 and 17 UM indicate potential insulin resistance, and levels above 17 strongly suggest that you do have insulin resistance.
Okay.
It's important to keep in mind that these are just general guidelines, and individual results should really be discussed with your healthcare professional to ensure that you have a proper interpretation.
Right. Now, what if someone's not able to get their insulin levels tested? Are there any other indicators that might suggest insulin resistance?
There are. Bikman suggests keeping an eye on your blood pressure because insulin resistance often leads to elevated blood pressure. He also recommends measuring ketones because ketones tend to rise when your insulin levels are low, which can actually reflect improved insulin sensitivity.
Oh, okay. Because ketones are that type of fuel that the body produces when it's burning fat for energy. So their presence in the blood can kind of be this indirect indicator of better insulin sensitivity.
Exactly. And ketone levels can be measured through blood, urine, or even breath tests, which offers another way to track those metabolic changes that are linked to insulin resistance.
So once we have an idea of our insulin sensitivity, how do we proceed from there?
Well, if your insulin levels fall within a healthy range, the focus should really be on maintaining that healthy lifestyle to prevent insulin resistance from developing in the first place. This includes things like following a balanced diet, getting regular exercise, managing your stress levels, and prioritizing sleep. However, if your insulin levels are elevated, indicating that you do have insulin resistance, well, then it's time to start implementing some more targeted strategies to restore your insulin sensitivity.
Okay. And what kind of strategies are we talking about?
This involves adopting an insulin-sensitizing dietary approach, incorporating both aerobic exercise and resistance training into your fitness routine, and potentially exploring options like cold exposure, certain supplements, or even medications under the guidance of your healthcare professional.
So it's about tailoring the approach to your individual needs and preferences.
Exactly. And be patient and consistent with your efforts, you know? It's a journey, not a sprint.
Now let's dive into the specifics of an insulin-sensitizing diet. Can you elaborate on the macronutrient ratios and the food choices that can actually help lower insulin levels and improve insulin sensitivity?
Sure. Bikman recommends a dietary approach that emphasizes those healthy fats and protein while controlling carbohydrate intake, especially the refined carbs and sugars.
Right, right. So can you give us a general guideline for those macronutrient ratios?
The specific ratios vary a little bit depending on individual needs and preferences, but a general guideline would be to aim for about 40-50% of your calories from fat, 30-40% from protein, and 20-30% from carbohydrates. Remember, these are just starting points, and adjustments might be necessary depending on how your body responds and your individual goals.
I see. Bikman actually mentions a quiz that can help assess your carbohydrate tolerance. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. The quiz can help you gauge how tolerant you are to carbohydrates, which can then inform your dietary choices. If you answer yes to 2 or more questions on this quiz, it suggests that you might be less tolerant to carbohydrates and need to be more mindful of how much you're consuming. However, if you answer yes to only 1 or none of the questions, well, then you might have more flexibility with carbohydrates in your diet. It's really about taking this personalized approach that considers those individual variations.
So it's about finding what works best for your own unique body. Now, what are some specific food choices that can help to actually lower insulin levels and improve insulin sensitivity?
Well, when it comes to carbohydrates, it's really about prioritizing quality over quantity. Choose those complex carbohydrates over the refined carbs and focus on those fiber-rich options.
So what are some examples of, good carbohydrate choices?
Good carbohydrate choices include things like whole grains like brown rice, quinoa, oats, fruits, vegetables, and legumes like beans and lentils.
And what about healthy fats?
Good fat choices include avocados, nuts, seeds, olive oil, fatty fish such as salmon and tuna, and coconut oil. You also want to make sure to include protein in every meal. This helps to stabilize your blood sugar levels and keep you feeling full and satisfied.
Okay, and what are some good sources of protein?
Lean meats, poultry, fish, eggs, dairy products, and then there are plant-based sources like beans, lentils, and tofu. Those are all great options as well.
Are there any foods that we should avoid?
Yes. It's really important to steer clear of sugary drinks, those highly processed foods, and those unhealthy fats, as these can contribute to insulin resistance and a host of other health problems.
So it's a common sense approach that prioritizes whole unprocessed foods, focusing on nutrient density over those empty calories.
Exactly. It's about nourishing your body with foods that truly support metabolic health.
Now, beyond those food choices, what about the timing and frequency of our meals? Does that matter?
It does, actually. Bikman recommends limiting snacking between meals to allow those insulin levels to drop and prevent that constant stimulation of insulin production. He suggests eating earlier in the day and avoiding late-night meals, as insulin sensitivity tends to be higher in the morning and lower in the evening.
So it's kind of like aligning our eating patterns with our body's natural circadian rhythms, which can help to optimize our metabolic function throughout the day.
Exactly. Now, let's explore a specific aspect of an insulin-sensitizing diet that's been gaining popularity: fermented foods.
Oh, yeah. Fermented foods, those have been around for centuries. Can you explain what actually makes them beneficial for insulin sensitivity?
Well, fermented foods go through this process where beneficial bacteria break down the sugars and starches in the food, which transforms the food's flavor and its nutritional profile. They can be beneficial for insulin sensitivity because they contain probiotics, the live bacteria that can support gut health and potentially improve metabolic function.
Okay, can you give us some examples of fermented foods?
Sure. Yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha are all great examples.
I actually enjoy all of those.
They're delicious.
Yeah.
And these foods not only provide those probiotics, but they also tend to be lower in sugar and higher in fiber than their non-fermented counterparts, which can further support insulin sensitivity. It's a delicious and nutritious way to add some variety to your diet and give your metabolic health a boost.
So we've talked about diet, exercise. Are there any other tools that we can use to combat insulin resistance?
In addition to those fermented foods, certain supplements might also play a role in improving insulin sensitivity.
Right. We discussed supplements briefly earlier. Can you remind us which ones have shown some promise in the research?
Sure, Bikman discusses several, including magnesium, chromium, berberine, alpha-lipoic acid, and omega-3 fatty acids.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on each of those?
Sure, magnesium, which we touched upon earlier, is involved in numerous body wall processes, including that insulin signaling, and studies have suggested that magnesium supplementation might actually enhance insulin sensitivity. Chromium enhances insulin action, and research suggests that chromium supplementation could be beneficial for people who have insulin resistance. Berberine, which is traditionally used in Chinese medicine, has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity and reduce blood sugar levels. Alpha-lipoic acid, which is an antioxidant that's involved in energy metabolism, might also improve insulin sensitivity, according to some studies. And lastly, omega-3 fatty acids, which are found in fatty fish like salmon and tuna, they have those anti-inflammatory properties that could be helpful for people with insulin resistance.
So that's quite a comprehensive list of potential supplements. It's really important to emphasize, though, that while these supplements show some promise, we still need more research to fully understand their efficacy and their safety.
You're absolutely right. It's always best to consult with a healthcare professional before you start taking any supplements because they could interact with other medications or existing health conditions that you might have.
Okay, so let's go back to exercise for a moment. We discussed its benefits earlier, but are there any specific types of exercise that are particularly effective for combating insulin resistance?
Exercise is really crucial for improving insulin sensitivity, building that muscle mass, and enhancing overall health. And as I mentioned before, Bikman recommends incorporating both aerobic exercise and resistance training into your routine for optimal results.
Right, we touched upon the differences between those two types earlier. Can you elaborate on their specific benefits for insulin resistance?
Sure. Aerobic exercise like running, swimming, or brisk walking helps to improve cardiovascular fitness, burn those calories, and enhance insulin sensitivity. And resistance training, which involves lifting weights or using bodyweight exercises, it helps to build and maintain that muscle mass, which is a major consumer of glucose and a really key player in insulin sensitivity.
So it's really about finding activities that you enjoy and that you can actually stick with long term, because consistency is key when it comes to exercise.
Absolutely. And remember to start gradually and increase the intensity and duration of your workouts as you get more fit. Even small amounts of exercise can make a big difference. So don't let the thought of those intense workouts discourage you from getting started.
What about for those who are ready to take their fitness to the next level? Are there any more advanced exercise strategies that might be beneficial?
For those seeking a challenge, Bikman suggests exploring something called high-intensity interval training, or HIIT.
Oh yeah, I've heard of HIIT. Can you explain how it works?
HI.
IT involves alternating periods of intense exercise with these periods of rest or low-intensity exercise.
Right. And this approach has actually been shown to be really effective for improving insulin sensitivity and boosting metabolism.
Sounds pretty intense.
It can be. So it's important to start slowly and gradually increase the intensity as your fitness improves. You don't want to overdo it and risk injury.
Good point.
Bikman also encourages incorporating cold exposure into your routine.
Yeah, we talked about the benefits of that earlier. Can you just quickly remind us why it can be so helpful?
Sure. Cold exposure can actually activate that brown fat, which, as we discussed, can help improve insulin sensitivity and give your metabolism a boost.
Okay. And are there different ways to incorporate cold exposure?
Yeah, there are. You can take cold showers, immerse yourself in cold water, or even just spend time in cold environments.
I'll admit that doesn't sound super appealing to me.
It's not for everyone, but the potential metabolic benefits might be worth considering. And remember, even small changes can make a difference. So start slowly and gradually increase your exposure to cold over time.
Good advice. Okay, so beyond diet and exercise, are there any other lifestyle factors that we haven't really touched on that can influence our insulin sensitivity?
Definitely. And managing these is crucial for a holistic approach to metabolic health. Stress management, for one, is really essential. Chronic stress can disrupt that hormonal balance and contribute to insulin resistance.
So what are some effective ways to manage stress?
Things like meditation, deep breathing exercises, yoga, spending time in nature, These can all help to reduce stress and promote relaxation.
And then there's sleep, which, we talked about earlier how important that is.
Right. Getting enough sleep is so important. Sleep deprivation can interfere with insulin signaling and contribute to insulin resistance, as we discussed.
So how much sleep should we be aiming for each night?
Aim for 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep each night to support your metabolic health and overall well-being.
Okay, that's good advice. And then managing those other health conditions like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, that's important too, right?
Absolutely. Because those conditions can actually worsen insulin resistance and increase the risk of complications.
So working with a healthcare professional to address those conditions and optimize our overall health is essential.
Exactly. It's all about taking this comprehensive approach to your health and well-being.
Right. Now, for individuals who are really struggling to manage insulin resistance through those lifestyle modifications alone, what other options are available?
Well, certain medications might be an option. We discussed metformin earlier, which can improve insulin sensitivity and lower blood sugar levels. There are also thiazolidinediones, or TZDs, which enhance insulin sensitivity primarily in fat cells. And then there are sulfonylureas and meglitinides, which stimulate the pancreas to produce more insulin.
Right, right. And it's, important to say again that medications should always be used under the supervision of a healthcare professional and as part of that comprehensive approach to managing insulin resistance.
Exactly. Lifestyle modifications should always be the foundation of treatment.
Okay. And in some cases, bariatric surgery might be an option for individuals with severe obesity. Is that right?
It can be, but it is a major procedure that does carry risks, and it should only be considered after careful evaluation and discussion with, a healthcare professional.
It's important to really weigh those potential benefits against the risk and understand that bariatric surgery isn't a quick fix. It really requires significant lifestyle changes and that ongoing medical follow-up.
Absolutely. It's not a decision to be taken lightly.
Okay. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive today into insulin resistance, let's kind of recap the key takeaways and empower our listeners with the knowledge they need to take control of their metabolic health. Because I think that's really the goal here.
It is. So insulin resistance, it's a widespread health concern that affects, a really significant portion of the population. And it's really at the root of so many chronic diseases.
It develops when our body cells become less responsive to insulin, which, results in those elevated blood sugar and insulin levels.
And insulin resistance is linked to this whole array of health problems, including heart disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, certain types of cancer, reproductive issues, skin problems, and even bone and joint health. It's really quite remarkable.
It is. And there are multiple factors that contribute to its development, including genetics, aging, a diet that's high in refined carbohydrates and sugars, lack of physical activity, chronic stress, environmental pollutants, and exposure to those endocrine disrupting chemicals. So many things play a role.
There are. But the good news is that insulin resistance can be prevented and even reversed through lifestyle modifications, particularly diet and exercise.
Right. So adopting an insulin sensitizing dietary approach that emphasizes healthy fats and protein while also controlling that carbohydrate intake, especially those refined carbs and sugars, that's crucial for managing insulin resistance.
It is. And incorporating both aerobic exercise and resistance training into your routine is essential for improving that insulin sensitivity and building muscle mass.
And then managing stress, prioritizing sleep, and addressing any other health conditions like high blood pressure and high cholesterol. Those can also support metabolic health.
They can. And for those individuals who struggle to manage insulin resistance through lifestyle changes alone, well, certain supplements or medications might be options to consider. However, it's crucial to consult with a healthcare professional before taking any supplements or starting any new medications.
Right. In some cases, bariatric surgery might be a consideration for individuals with severe obesity. But it's important to understand the risks and benefits associated with that procedure and to have a thorough discussion with your doctor.
You're right.
So to kind of sum it all up, understanding insulin resistance empowers you to make those informed choices about your health and well-being.
It really does. And taking proactive steps to manage insulin resistance can help reduce your risk of developing those chronic diseases, improve your energy levels, enhance your mood, and contribute to a healthier, more vibrant life overall.
It really is a journey worth embarking on. And remember, you don't have to go it alone. There are resources available to support you, including healthcare professionals, registered dietitians, certified personal trainers, and even those online communities.
Right. Don't hesitate to seek out guidance and support as you navigate the complexities of insulin resistance and metabolic health.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on this deep dive into insulin resistance. I really hope our listeners found it informative and empowering.
It was my pleasure being here today and sharing this information with you and your listeners.
Great. Until next time, everyone, keep diving deep.